Welcome back to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and today we slow down and let this settle. Mark chapter 9 and 10 shows us what happens after the mountaintop moments and when the brightness fades and discipleship returns to the daily road. Questions, weaknesses, misunderstanding, relationships, and hard choices. This is where faith becomes real, not in perfect confidence, but in honest prayer, humble service, and continued following. So if your week has felt ordinary or costly or unfinished, you're not far from God. This is where Jesus does deep work. So let's begin. Now in Mark chapter 9, verses 2 to 8, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. Mark tells us in verse 2 that he was transfigured before them. In verse 3, his clothing becomes shining white. In verse 4, Moses and Elijah appear. And then in verse 6, Peter, frightened, begins to speak. Then in verse 7, a voice comes from the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Hear him. In verse 8, it says, and suddenly they saw no man anymore save Jesus only. The glory fades, but Jesus remains. So what's the principle here? Spiritual clarity always points us back to listening to Jesus in daily life. Now in Mark chapter 9, verses 14 to 29, they come down the mountain to confusion and pain. A father pleads for his suffering son. And Jesus says, if thou canst believe, all things are possible, in verse 23. The father answers with honesty, Lord, I believe. Help thou mine unbelief, in verse 24. This is not polished faith. It is real faith. In verse 25 to 27, Jesus heals the boy. Faith here is not confidence. It is trust mixed with honesty. So here's something to think about. Where do I need to pray? Help thou mine unbelief. Do I believe Jesus receives in perfect faith? Next, in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 to 32, Jesus speaks again of his coming death. The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, in verse 31. And then Mark adds, they understood not that saying and were afraid to ask him, in verse 32. Not understanding does not disqualify discipleship. Fear sometimes silences questions. Jesus keeps walking with them anyway. Next, in chapter 9, verses 33 to 37, the disciples argue about who is the greatest. And Jesus in verse 35 sits down and says, if any man desires to be first, the same shall be last of all and servant of all. Then in verse 37, he takes a child into his arms. Whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me. Greatness for Jesus looks small. So the principle here is that true greatness is measured by humility and care for the overlooked. Next, in chapter 9, verses 38 to 41, John says, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and we forbade him. And that's in verse 38. In verse 39, Jesus responds gently, forbid him not. God's work is wider than our expectations. Then Jesus adds in verse 41, whosoever shall give you a cup of water shall not lose his reward. Small kindness still counts. Now in chapter 10, verses 1 to 12, Jesus teaches about marriage and commitment. He points back to God's design. What therefore God hath joined together, let no man put asunder, in verse 9. Jesus speaks toward faithfulness and care, not loopholes. Next, in Mark chapter 10, verses 13 to 16, people bring children. The disciples stop them, and Jesus is displeased and says, suffer the little children to come unto me, in verse 14. Mark tells us he took them up in his arms and blessed them. That's in verse 16. Now, note here that Jesus never rushes past those with no status. So the principle here is that God's kingdom belongs to those who come with open, trusting hearts. Next, in verses 17 to 31, a man asks, What shall I do that I may inherit eternal life? That's in verse 17. And Mark adds a tender detail in verse 21. Jesus, beholding him, loved him. Then Jesus invites him to let go in verse 22. The man walks away sorrowful. In verse 27, Jesus says, with men it is possible, but not with God. Letting go is painful, but God supplies what we cannot. Next, in chapter 10, verses 35 to 45, James and John asks for position of honor. Jesus replies in verse 43, whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister. Then in verse 45, and he anchors it in himself. The Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister. Next, in verses 46 to 52, blind man Bartimaeus cries out, Jesus, thou Son of David, have mercy on me. That's in verse 47. Then in 51, Jesus stops and asks, what wilt thou that I should do unto thee? In verse 51, Bartimaeus answers, Lord, that I might receive my sight. Jesus in verse 52 says, thy faith had made thee whole. And Mark closes with quiet beauty in verse 52. He says, he followed Jesus in the way. So in closing, I want us to sit with this. Mark chapter 9 and 10 reminds us that faith continues after the mountaintop. Honest prayer is welcomed. Greatness looks like service. And following Jesus often means letting go. So if today your faith feels ordinary or costly or quietly faithful, remember this. Jesus walks the road with us. He listens to honest cries, and he keeps inviting us, follow me in the way. That's it for another week of our 26 weeks of our New Testament studies. Thank you once again for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit of God continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. And once again, if your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next time as we continue our walk with Mark in Mark chapter 11 and 12. Until then, God bless.